Augustine's Rule, a commentary by Adler Zumkeller OSA, Chapter 4, The Spirit of Poverty. The Gospel tells us how Jesus one day invited a young man to follow him. "If you wish to be perfect, go, sell what you have and give the money to the poor. Then you will have a lasting treasure in heaven. Then come and follow me." But the young man could not bring himself to answer the call. The sacrifice seemed too great, for he had many possessions. In one of his letters, St. Augustine tells us the decisive part this gospel story played in his own life. He writes in letter 157, "I fell in love with the perfection of which the Lord was speaking, and I acted accordingly, not by my own power, but by the strength of his grace. Even though I was not rich, the demand made of me was not any less. They renounce the whole world who renounce both what they possess and what they desire to possess." Evangelical poverty in the following of Christ is not a matter of simply of external renunciation. According to Augustine, it must affect our entire attitude to life. Our poverty has value in God's eyes only if it is truly a virtue in the heart. In a sermon to the people, Augustine said on one occasion, "Of what value is it to you to have empty hands if your heart is full of greed?" On Psalm 51. His words were a warning to the many poor of the episcopal city, but they are even more appropriate for us religious. Those who praise the poverty of the cloister must rid themselves of the desire for personal possessions. The purpose of evangelical poverty is precisely to set the human heart free for God and his service. Augustine was profoundly convinced from personal experience that the voluntary renunciation of earthly possessions opens and expands the human heart for God and the things of heaven. Those who are empty of desire for money are filled with God. Sermon 177. Therefore, even though he knew the wretched state of the poor in Hippo, and he did all he could to relieve their distress, he could nonetheless say to them from the pulpit, "Listen to me, you who are poor. Is there anything you do not possess when you possess God? And listen to me, you who are rich. Do you possess anything when you do not possess God?" Sermon 311. The first chapter of Augustine's Rule also suggests how deep the social gulf must have been that divided the great mass of the poor from the rich and powerful. Even in monastic life, it must have been unpleasantly obvious. There too, as Augustine tells us, there were people from all strata of society, some from wealthy and important families, including even former senators and owners of large estates, but chiefly slaves and freed men as well as peasants, workmen, and those who practiced other simple trades. On his work on the monks. As a result, contrasts in attitude and ethos were more marked than today. It took a great deal of idealism for Augustine to try to bridge this social gulf in his monasteries by forming a community based on Christian love. He says that in his monasteries no distinction was made between those who entered the community poor and those who had brought property with them. The oneness created by love must take precedence over the rank bestowed by an earthly inheritance. Sermon 356. his effort to rise above class distinctions in his monasteries doubtless helped not a little to solving the social problems of his time. The social situation of the time was also the reason why, in the first chapter of his Rule, Augustine makes an important distinction that will recur frequently in subsequent chapters. He distinguishes between those who owned something in the world and those who owned nothing. He addresses now the one, now the other group. He realizes that even in his monastic rule, he must deal with people as individuals. The spirit of poverty, he says, shows itself in the cheerful willingness with which we renounce what we owned before entering the monastery, or what we might have acquired, what we desired to possess. It allows in the contentment that keeps us from looking for those things in the monastery that we were unable to have in the world. It is good from time to time to evaluate our personal wishes. For example, our plans for vacation or travel. A lack of contentment is contrary to the spirit of evangelical poverty. It shows clearly that the heart is still attached to earthly things. Augustine understands monastic poverty as a closer following of Jesus Christ. But in this following, the decisive factor is not outward actions, but interior attitude. God is not interested in how much a person renounces, but in the person's detachment of heart from all things. Augustine brings this point home in a sermon. A man was converted to monastic life and left his father's wretched hut, in which there was hardly bed or box to be found. He acted properly, very properly. We must not mock him and say, "You didn't leave anything at all." Those who have abandoned much must not be proud or consider themselves superior to him. We know that Peter was only a fisherman. What did he have that he could abandon when he followed the Lord? Or his brother Andrew, or John and James, the sons of Zebedee? They too were fishermen. Yet what did they say? "We have left everything and followed you." The Lord did not answer them, "Have you forgotten that you were poor?" What did you really leave? They abandoned much who abandoned not only what they possessed, but also what they would have liked to possess. Is there any human being who does not wish daily to increase his or her possessions? This desire has now been pruned. It was boundless, now limits have been set to it. And have they really left nothing? On the contrary, Peter abandoned the entire world, but he also received the entire world, like those who have nothing and yet own everything. On Psalm 103, Sermon 3. The real issue here is that poverty of spirit, which the Lord calls blessed in his Sermon on the Mount, is when on one occasion Augustine asked, "What does it mean to be poor in spirit?" He answers himself, "It means poor in outlook, not simply in material means. Those who are poor in spirit are humble. They hear the cry of the lowly and do not spurn their pleas." Sermon 53. Nowadays, we might say that they identify with the poor and that their hearts are touched by the needs of the poor. Poverty in spirit, therefore, implies a renunciation of any quest of prestige and triumphalism. As in the passage just cited, so elsewhere Augustine consistently interprets the poor in spirit as the humble. Even when he presents Christ as the model of the truly poor, he presents Christ in his humility, in his self-emptying. He preached in Sermon 14, "For our sake Christ became poor, although he was rich, and look at his wealth. All things were made through him, and apart from him nothing was made. Look at his poverty. He was made flesh and dwelt among us. He is conceived in a virgin's womb. He is enclosed in her maternal body. What poverty! He is born in a small stable, wrapped in swaddling clothes, and placed in a manger. The Lord of heaven and earth, who created the angels from nothing and made all things visible and invisible, cries, is fed, grows, increases in age, and hides his majesty. Finally, he is made prisoner. He is scorned and scourged, mocked, spat upon, slapped, crowned with thorns, hanged from a tree, and pierced with a lance. What poverty! See, that is the kind of head of the poor that I want for myself. Let us see in the truly poor the members of this poor man. For Augustine, the nobility of genuine monastic poverty is due not least to the fact that it mirrors an essential trait of the God-man himself, and is capable of uniting the members more closely to their head.